Hello and welcome to the ISRK podcast. I'm your host, Kumar Vikrant. I'm a researcher at the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, Hanyang University, Seoul, Korea. ISRK, that is Indian Students and Researchers in Korea, is a voluntary support group that works towards the benefit of the Indian diaspora in Korea. So on today's episode, I have the pleasure to be in conversation with Dr. Jennifer Chi. Jennifer has been the director of exhibitions, chief curator, and is in general a senior leader in arts and the museum community worldwide. So Jennifer, thank you very much for taking out the time to talk with me, and it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, I'm very, very, very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me,
Yeah, sure.
Vikrant. So,
Yeah, and to begin the conversation, I would like to know about your PhD journey in arts and antiquities.
sure.
I want to ask that because um, for me, as well as people around me, most are from the core science disciplines. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm not, I'm not too sure how the progression is in a PhD, like in the area of arts and
Right,
antiquities. So I'm really
right.
interested in knowing how your experience was and what goes on in
Mm-hmm.
the field. So can you briefly
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. So I really started as a historian.
Mm,
Just a little bit about my background. I
sure,
am a
yeah.
first generation American. My father lived or was born in Korea during Japanese occupation. Um, and that's sort of a long and arduous and
Yeah,
a story that has trauma in it.
yeah.
But he was a doctor, and he came to the United States after the Korean War, which was I think he came in 1954.
I see.
So um, I have. I call myself mixed blood Korean. I don't like the word race. I think race is a
Mm,
social construct, and I think we
mm,
all should be working to alleviate that word from our vocabularies, just kind
sure,
of
yeah,
get rid of it. Um, I think that it just generally has,
yeah.
anytime you hear the word race, it can be charged. So my father came here in 1954. My mother is Irish. Um, I identify much more with, the Korean culture
I see.
in many ways because our household was very much structured around Korean values.
Sure.
Um, and of course, my father being an immigrant and coming from Korea, the things that he stressed were education,
Mm,
education,
I understand.
education,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
and
yeah,
physical education, and just really hard work and perseverance mentally, in your soul, and physically. And so I, at first, had wanted to become a psychologist. And that was something that my father really discouraged me from, because he had come from as a war-torn country. And I think
sure. Yeah.
he felt that that could be a discipline that could be very taxing on me.
Mm,
But I had always liked to put pieces of puzzles
yeah,
together.
yeah.
I love multi kind of contextual studies, and so when I was in college, I began studying ancient history,
Mm,
which includes, languages,
yeah.
historical text, and then I fell in love with the arts, and went on to study at Oxford, which
Yeah.
was a just a dramatic, well, not dramatic experience, but it fundamentally altered the way that I studied and the way that I sort of conceptualized my work. It was one
Yeah.
of the most important experiences I've had. And then I also, while I was studying classics there, I went on excavations. Worked at
Archaeological
Aphrodisias in
site.
Turkey. Yes, archaeological sites.
So you have
And
been
then,
to Göbekli Tepe. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
well,
Göbekli Tepe?
I am a Romanist. So I was part of the archaeological team that was at Aphrodisias
Ah, I see.
in Turkey.
Mm,
It's the city of Aphrodite. There was a salt well there, and it really is one of
fascinating. Yeah.
it's absolutely
Yeah.
fascinating, and one of the most beautiful places, romantic places I've ever been.
Ah, yes.
So it lives up to its name.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of different, when you're studying something like ancient history, want to have experience in archaeology, in art history, so teaching. I then went on to become a curator, and then an exhibitions director and chief curator, where I founded a program at NYU, and then went on to be a deputy director and chief curator at the Brooklyn Museum. So I've had a lot of art experience.
Yeah. Thank you very much for elaborate explanations. And I really am interested in knowing, like you talked about Oxford and your journey through your studies and art. So I'm really interested in knowing like how your education at Oxford and also your doctoral studies shaped your view of the arts and the antiquities, because I reckon like we are contemporaries gazing upon the work of the ancients. So I reckon you
Mm-hmm.
must have had to study a lot about the socio-cultural aspects as well as history, etc. So how did that education shape your view of the arts?
It's been a long journey for me. I've had,
Sure. Yeah.
about a 20-year career. And
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
so, just to, in looking back, from the beginning, what I loved about classics and classical archaeology is it's really intellectually rigorous.
Yes.
You have to be able to look at textual evidence in its original language. You need to know Greek and Latin.
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't have a corpus of material that is, let's say, really robust. We might
Mm-hmm.
have 10% of what we
Yes.
know about Roman culture,
Right.
maybe even,
Right.
1%, and we're still learning something
Mm-hmm.
every year through excavations. So you're constantly keeping up and looking at those things. And then, of course, for me, it was the curatorial aspect. How do you present this
Yeah.
material to an audience and make it a general audience and make it not only understandable but interesting, appearing, or connected to contemporary society? That was
Right.
always the question that I had.
Sure, because in museums, like I wonder, like various different kinds of people visit the museum. So I think like when you present an exhibition or a certain set of displays, then it must be it should resonate with people from a general background, right? Who are not
Hmm.
too
Hmm.
specialized in the subject. So I think you must have had to think in a very broad way to present that material in
I think
museum.
you, yeah, I think you think both in a specific and a broad way.
Right.
Exhibitions and installations, you need to have, I would say, these what are called sort of narrative bubbles that
Yeah.
relate to one another. And I truly believe that every piece that you select in either small scale exhibitions, large
Right.
scale exhibitions, or permanent installations, semi-permanent installations, they have to have some sort of relationship with the objects around them. There has to be some sort of narrative cord
Yeah.
through. And you have to be looking at contemporary society and what they are interested in. What I've come around to
Yeah.
is that, classics is a very conservative field. Museology is a conservative field. Museums are very conservative
Yeah.
institutions. And in my work as of late, I've been taking a really kind of post-colonial view of the ancient world. Uh, the program that I founded at NYU
Right.
was really meant to break down the really strict disciplines and the both the geographical and chronological limitations that were put on the ancient world.
Yeah.
And so instead of just focusing on these cultures that were Western driven, so Egypt, ancient Near East, Greece, Rome, I was going to places like Kazakhstan, Israel, Malta, Bulgaria, Moldova, and kind of showing that the Western canon was very limited.
Yes.
Um, and not only in display of material and selection of material, but in approach. And so a lot of my work at NYU as both an exhibitions director and as a professor was to really teach students or general audiences that, you know, we can learn so much more when we go outside of these Western art history textbooks
Yeah.
and ask the question of what was going on in Central Asia at the same time that was going on in let's say Athens in the 5th century.
Right. That
And you
conversation
find,
needs to happen. Yeah. Yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
and
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
mhm. And so that's, really where my work has tried to push the field. And
Yeah.
I would say that, we did a wonderful job at ISA. The other thing that, we sort of became known for, and what I one of my favorite aspects of that position was working with contemporary artists who look back upon their heritage. So someone like Michael Rakowitz, who is a Iraqi Jew, looking back at his heritage
Yeah.
through the lens of the sort of Western destruction of and absolutely flagrant disregard of their millennia of heritage and things that develop out of that culture that even today, affect us. So it began to be a political dialogue between
Sure. Yeah.
contemporary and ancient arts.
Fascinating. Like, I'm
And
really
you realize
excited.
I went into this because I'm terrible at math. I don't fit the math stereotype. So
The Asian stereotype of math.
yes, I'm trying to break those down too. So
Sure. I'm sure the world is grateful for that, Jennifer, because you're
mhm,
you're a leader in arts and museum aspects. So yeah, that's something. And talking, like getting to hear you talk about your stuff so passionately, like it's I think the our viewers will find that really interesting. And
mhm,
yeah, Jennifer, I was also interested to hear about your experience at NYU and the Brooklyn
mhm.
Museum,
Sure.
etc., where you have been the chief director of the exhibitions and also the curator.
Mhm,
So what
mhm.
can you help us understand, like what goes on in these sorts of work? Like, because I really, it's a big puzzle for me, to be frank. Like
Right.
from the
It
concept,
should be in
yeah,
some senses, right?
yes. So from the conceptualization, because what I understand is like there was an archaeological dig and you got the artifacts and you want to present that in the museum. So can you briefly help us uh, understand what goes on in the process and how does everything fit
Mhm.
in the exhibition? I understand that it may be a too broad a question to help
Mm,
understand us in a
no,
short time, but sure, yeah,
sure. And if I'm talk too much, just please interrupt me. But
sure,
um, I actually did an exhibition with my co-curator was Pedro Azara. I always like to curate in groups because I feel uh, I'm not an ivory tower type of person. I don't
sure,
like to give I like multiple voices, and we always included people from source countries because there is this Western way of we know everything, and
yeah,
we'll bring to you. And in fact, if you look at it the other way, or in just a little bit more complex of a way of sort of osmosis, or giving back to one another,
sure,
it becomes very interesting. But I worked on a show that looked at two excavations from the beginning of the 20th century when there was partage. Now, partage is when a university like the University of Pennsylvania sponsored all of the excavations at Ur in Sumeria. It was a very large kind of capital city,
right,
and that particular excavator was much more interested in the splash and kind of prestige of finding the material. So you see a lot of, articles that were written, and then the material was just sort of brought around and
so,
shown
so
in
that
its
drives the
excavated
narrative.
form.
Yeah, so that
Hmm.
drives the narrative in a certain direction, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
And then we compared it to another very famous excavator contemporaneous,
Mhm.
Henri Frankfurt, who was excavating at Tel Asmar. And from the very beginning, he was using art historical language to describe the pieces. So he saw this as soon as the material was coming from the trench, as being art historical. And so very interesting Telesmar material is treated a little bit more in a art historical way in the museums that the material ended up in than let's say in an archaeology museum, which is looking at how things, you know, sort of come out of the ground. But exhibitions in general, Vikrant, they're incredibly complicated undertakings. Sometimes you have, like, if you have an idea, you might need 20 lenders from across, you know, the United States and Europe. And part of my job was to negotiate those things and to work with government officials,
Right.
to ensure the best, you know, material was coming over, and that we had a, you know, really strong narrative. But I worked with everyone from U.S. ambassadors
Yeah.
and then ambassadors to the U.S. to our country to bring material because it
I
was
see.
just
Yeah.
so new. Um, to, you know, as I said, really great artists. And then I had
Yeah.
a you're only as good as your team. I had a team of 12 that, you know, really supported me, and I look at as a sort of a relationship of we both were giving, you know, to one another. So, and then at Brooklyn, I became, you know, as I said, I am a first generation American, and I think all of us who have been living in the United States and even around the world have really, you know, questioned what are we doing, you know, to give to society so that diversity, equity, inclusion, and access is not just a performative thing,
Yes.
but
Yeah.
it's a real thing, and it's something that becomes authentic in institutions. And I think we're only at the beginning of that. But
Yep.
I went to the Brooklyn Museum because I was given the opportunity to work with a lot of contemporary artists that were looking at issues of power, race, and equity. And I, you know, I have a sort of very strong, I have a passion towards making these sort of some emerging artists really understood and brought to the forefront. So very different sort of things, but in some senses aligned, you know.
Yeah.
As a curator, I feel that I can constantly grow and learn, and I haven't been afraid of breaking out of my original field. So that's something unusual about my work.
That's also something that helps you grow continuously throughout the career. And I
Mhm,
think that's really important. Yeah.
mhm.
Pursue different things. And so, Jennifer, I'm really interested to hear you talk about some of your favorite exhibitions. Like I read up your portfolio and restoring the Minoans and when the Greeks
Mhm,
ruled Egypt, the Ptolemy dynasty,
mhm,
right? And
mhm, mhm.
the yeah, Nubia and nomads and the networks, right?
Networks, yeah.
So yeah, those were really interesting to see, scroll through and read in
Mhm.
your portfolio. So I'm really interested to hear from
Sure.
you about your favorite exhibitions a bit. Yeah.
Um, you know, I wouldn't say I have a favorite exhibition, but
Hmm.
I can tell you the most challenging one in
Yeah.
terms of just
Sure. Yeah.
logistics
Hmm.
and also interpretation was working with Kazakhstan,
All
because
right.
none of the material that we were looking
Yeah.
at, this is the Nomad and Networks exhibition, and they have an incredibly rich history of
Yeah. Yeah.
nomadic excavations and
I think
permafrost.
they were on the Silk Route, right? So
Yes,
yeah. Yeah.
that's right. And the Silk Route is, you know, connects, you know, everywhere from China all the way through to Greece.
Right.
So you which could be a whole other topic. But we were looking at nomadic material, and you know, there's this general misconception that nomads, they just roam everywhere
Hmm.
and they have sort of no
Yeah.
permanent home. But this is really not true. During the summer, they would spend time in higher altitudes, and because of the fact that it was cooler. And then during the wintertime, they would come down more towards the plains to do hunting. And so there were definite routes that they took. But what I found was that there is a rule in Kazakhstan that if you are excavating, you own the material until it's turned over to the state.
I see.
So I So I was not only working with several national museums, I think there were 4 national museums, but I was also working with archaeologists who had never
Yeah.
worked outside of America before, or excuse me, outside of Kazakhstan
Oh, I
before.
see.
And so um, I spent a lot. One of the things that I think is uh, uh, why we were so successful is that there's also this attitude that everyone should speak English. And I always entered into any kind of business negotiation, if I didn't speak the language, with someone who spoke the language. In Kazakhstan, everyone started speaking Kazakh to me because everyone thought that I was Kazakh. But
I
I had a
oh yeah,
I
yeah,
had a
because
Russian uh,
yeah, a lot of Korea people live there, so yeah,
not only that, but I think it's Central Asia,
yeah, sure,
and
yeah,
so it's the crossroads of Europe and Asia. So I'm having an Irish mother and a Korean father. I think how it's a very diverse society that way, and
that's
it's
right,
a
yeah,
really interesting society that way. But you know, and there was still a level of, I wouldn't say Soviet paranoia, but just systems in place, that created a bureaucracy of
I see.
um, real tedium. And I wound up, having a contract canceled 2 weeks before the exhibition was supposed to open, and it was central material. And I had to make a trip to Kazakhstan just to sort of reevaluate that contract and determine what was needed in order to have that central material come. And I think I went to Kazakhstan 6 or 7 times, and a lot of the times I would have to call the U.S. ambassador, or excuse me, the Kazakh ambassador to the United States to ensure that a meeting would start for me, because that's how little there had been interest in the material before. But now there's, a great amount of interest in it. And so I'm proudest to say that I think it really opened up a channel or an area of interest that has sparked other types of study around that, time period in that area of the world.
It's fascinating. And, so you talked about your travels a lot in relation to your work, and
Hmm.
how important is to travel at different parts of the world, and uh, what does that in reference to your perspective of different societies, cultures, and humans in general? I suppose that you begin to appreciate them more or begin to understand different cultures more broadly when traveling a lot. So can you briefly share your views on the subject?
Hmm. Absolutely. But, I would also say, and I keep coming back to this, Kumar, because I think it's part of, um, I am very, very close, to parts of my Korean
Hmm.
family, and I
Yeah.
consider myself very Korean, but I actually have only been to Korea twice. So,
I see.
w- earlier on in my, graduate career, and when I was in college, I just fell in love with in, ancient history, meaning Roman history, just because of the pure force in which Rome was able to take over
Oh yeah.
on an administrative level.
Yeah.
Um, and just that it reminds me still today of, many things that are going on in America. There's a lot of real comparisons now that we can make. Um, but I spent a year and a half in Italy. So I learned Italian, and I think language is the first step in really understanding a culture. Um, it just gives you a real sense of the mentality and the nuances of the mentality. So I'm extraordinarily privileged to be able to speak Italian and have spent, time there. Um, it changed the way I viewed the world, in that it made me realize that once you get outside of that kind of American eccentric mentality, there's much more to learn. I spent time in Switzerland as well as in uh, Paris, and I speak a bit of French. So that just, in comparison to just even other European countries, opened my mind up enormously. I lived in Turkey, um, and I've lived, and spent time in Israel. So in all of these aspects, and this is because of, this really kind of unusual position I had.
Yeah.
I've just been able to see that multiple lenses and standing back and taking alternative views really can open up minds rather than close them. And I've also learned how, I think, to show a level of respect towards cultures um, by trying to learn language, or at least having, an interpreter with me,
Sure.
so that I don't come off as being um, disrespectful, honestly.
Oh,
So that's what, traveling has taught me, to be just very open-minded. And it's affected my work that way, as well as
yeah.
having, a tutor at Oxford that was incredibly demanding and writing 16-page papers, in a week,
In a
from
week.
research to and one week I had usually 6 days. So
Wow.
between
Challenging.
14 to 17, yes. And that really taught me how to focus in, narrow in, and determine what a real narrative is, and to work being very agile intellectually. That changed me too, to be able to study, at Oxford. So, which is a very different system than American system.
And Jennifer, you touched upon languages there, and um, do you have any tips for language learners, by the way? And I wanted to ask, like, uh, when you watch a
But
movie or read a book in the original
mhm.
language, how different is that but compared to reading an English translation of that?
That's dependent on quality, isn't it?
Hmm?
Of
Sure.
translation, really, right?
Right, right, yes.
So you really you have to be, when you're looking at, let's say, original Latin text, there will be a source that is known as the source that's closest to, the original language, if you have to
Right.
read it in translation. But there's just always nuances that are missed. There's always, if you don't read the language. And so, for me, you know, just understand. I'll just give you this example that I
Yeah.
walked into a cafe once in Italy, and I said, "No, posso avere un cappuccino scaldo," which means like a really hot cappuccino, because I like my
Scalo is
milk
hot.
hot.
Yeah.
And the barista looked at me and was like, "Ma che scaldo?" You don't. It's meant to be a breakfast
Right.
drink, whereas in America, I had always looked at it as just the drink, that you go to, that you have warm, that wakes you up when you're studying. And
Right.
it's just that type of nuance, both in language as
Oh,
well
yes.
as in just the way and presentation, I think, that makes your world richer if you can see all of those, different environments. So, um, yeah. Um,
Yeah.
and
I
I,
also
I
generally like my coffee hot, so
do you?
yes, whether
I
it's
don't
summer
like
or winter.
warm milk, so
I don't like milk in general, but whether it's
right.
summer or winter, I always take my coffee hot. So
Yeah.
yeah, in Korea,
So,
people like iced americano a lot, and
hmm
in summers they're always uh, very shocked to see me order a hot coffee on a hot summer day. So that
hmm
there's a cultural difference there. So
um,
yeah,
yeah. I think it's just all of these things. And one of the questions that I actually wanted to ask you
sure,
is,
yeah.
how large is the Indian community in Korea? And is it mainly a community that is, there to study? And if are there areas that one studies in Korea because it's considered to be um, somewhere that has excellent, sort of standards?
Sure. I think the Indian community in Korea is in a few thousands. Uh, yeah, a few thousands Indians are here in Korea, and most of them generally are involved in the higher education sector. Lots of them are doing their masters here, PhDs and postdocs, and some are even professors here. But most of them are primarily involved in science disciplines, statistically speaking. And
Hmm
right. So, because in recent times, as you said, Korea became a developed country quite fast, right? So, yeah. So,
Incredibly fast.
yeah. So, lots of universities have sprung up. Those are quite high, in science
Mhm.
rankings, and particularly it's famous for the tech and engineering sector, right? There are lots of
Mhm.
universities that are in top QS world rank, top 100, top 200. So those are attracting many of the Indians to Korea. Of course, there are Indians involved in the, for example, the K-drama industry, and nowadays in movies as well, but those are very few in number.
Mhm.
Um, and what I want to say, like recently, Hallyu has become big throughout the globe,
Mhm.
right? So those
Mhm.
are attracting lots of Indians and other Asians, and I want to say people from the West as well, coming into Korea. So yeah, that's happening right now.
Mhm. Mhm.
Hallyu is real. Yeah.
And can I ask you, it was very, my brother lived in Korea for a year. Can I
Sure.
ask you what you find are the three kind of most, I guess, visible or apparent cultural norms in Korea that were new to you when you arrived?
Oh, yes. Uh, I would say the politeness. For example, when you hand anyone cash in Korea, so you always use two hands instead of one.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
that was new to me, right?
Mhm.
In some states of India, people do that, but India is a very big country, so we generally do not have an idea of such subtle cultural norms when in India. So that was very new to me. And mm, others, not really cultural norm, but I found Korea to be very safe uh,
Mhm.
and pollution free. I want to say that coming from back home
Really?
in India. Yeah,
Uh,
of course, there are
mhm.
talks about air quality, etc. But from back home, compared to that, it's relatively clean. So
Mhm.
I'm sorry, your question
Mhm.
was about the cultural norms, but I cannot think of that many at the moment. But yeah,
No, no, no. That's fine. I mean, for I guess for me, what I see is it's a society that is very family oriented.
oh yeah,
You
yeah,
know, uh, uh, with everything from having an oppa in the family, which is the oldest son, which was my father, um, who, as Vikrant knows, was the father of 8 children when his father died during, actually was killed by the communists during the Korean War. And so my father became Oppa of 8 children. And then there's, an older sister, and very much so. I still find that that is the case. Even my cousin, who's a month older than me, he now considers himself my Oppa, and he tells me how to behave sometimes, which I love. Uh, but a very close knit families, but with hierarchies in them. And then those
sure.
hierarchies, I think,
Oh yeah,
spread out into society. And I
right.
think one of the things, and I don't know if this happened to you when is happening to you, is that I had a lot of pressure put on me to succeed academically. Uh, my father went to Seoul University. My uncle went to Seoul University. My father was considered brilliant with languages, translated, George Orwell's Animal Farm. So I had a very strong pressure to be something that has a title to it.
Sure. Right.
And I don't, I think that pressure probably still goes on, in 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 Korea today, that kind of um, sort of structuring by
Uh,
succeeding in certain areas.
I want to say that it still is like that in many aspects, and this was not new to me because, in many respects, my culture back home, from where I come from, it's also very similar to that. So it was not something new to me. But
Okay.
yet, yes, it
Mm-hmm.
does happen on the ground and still very much is so. But
Mm-hmm.
nowadays, I see lots of changes also happening, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
uh, nowadays the newer generation that is becoming parents, so they are more in tune with, because they have actually faced these circumstances earlier in their lives. So now they are bringing the change on the ground level, But yeah, what you said is that still happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I
And
think the extent of it is diminishing with time.
mm-hmm,
Yeah.
mm-hmm. Can I ask one
Sure, sure. Go
other,
ahead. Go
so,
ahead, please.
um, so, um, I have been, one of the things that I look at as a first generation American who really does have a lot of respect and internally, I think epigenetically, and just I'm Korean. My cousins say this because I call them, I ask them questions like, well, what about I've studied, read 3 articles on the emotion Han. And I think we briefly touched upon this.
That's right.
Um, when I learned about Han, it was a revelation to me because I think, some of the struggles that my family went through in Korea, it very much so can be passed down if it's not
Sure.
something, that one speaks about. And I wonder, we see now a lot it's a concept that's now being explored in so many different artistic media. Everything from,
It's being talked
the
about a lot.
fine
Yeah.
arts to movies to,
Right.
cinema, literature. um, what is your feeling about this emotion, and do you see it as part of Korean society? Because my brother absolutely did, even before he knew about the concept. So,
Right. The generational trauma, I think it's something very real. And
hmm
people feel it every day in many aspects of life. In terms of Korean society, I cannot say it because I'm not an expert in that regard,
hmm
and I also do not have a close Korean connection in that regard to do justice in talking about that. But sure, I read articles by Dr. David, and I think you know him, right? And
I
David
do know
Tizar.
David Tizar. I
Yeah,
don't agree with some of the people he's had on his show regarding
sure.
Han, but
Right. But that's the beauty of diversity, right? You get to hear
hmm
various aspects of everything. So, um, sure, I think it's real, and I think it needs to be talked about. But of course, I'm not an authority on it, so I
hmm
cannot say much on that. Yeah.
hmm hmm um I kind of feel like that's something that is defining, just in the sense of even looking back at, Korean culture. It's something for, I think, the Indian community to
Sure.
think about, because there might be parallels to an
Yeah. Yeah.
Indian, history.
Oh yeah.
And I think there are a lot of things. This is why post-colonial dialogue makes people so uncomfortable.
Oh yes.
Uh,
And
and
those kind of discussions can often be very charged and very politically different and also ideologically different. So there needs to be communication to bridge the gap
Mhm.
and also to help understand each other better.
Yes, and that's a wonderful way of looking at it. And I think that, from the perspective of being someone who is in the art field now, and where there's a real question of what are museums for, because in
Right.
America, there's been a lot of discussion about the systemic, institutionalized sort of privilege that
Sure,
goes
sure.
with being in. I was just recently reading a report on leadership in museums that was done by the AMD, and it's really quite it's an extraordinary report, because it shows that 94% of museums are run by Caucasians. So you're get
No
no
surprises there. Yeah,
no. One would like to change that,
sure.
so that you could have more perspectives. But I think having more dialogue around difficult art, difficult pieces, or pieces that are challenging notions of power and, race and equity, and, globally, as well as, within each country, there has to be some courage there, to really
Yes,
reevaluate and look at who we are as, in just a human sense, and what we have allowed to happen in order to learn about the visual culture of places like the Republic of Congo, or the Democratic Republic of Congo, or Nigeria
sure.
and or all of these Benin plaques that are now being returned. You know, we have to have some humanity here, and
Sure.
understand that much of this material was taken in a way that was not only damaging to cultural heritage,
Oh,
but
yes.
inflicted pain upon, hundreds of thousands of people.
Oh, yes.
So, and I think that is where my work is really now, is to do that kind of hard work and want to have that kind of conversation. So,
And continuing that dialogue in science is also changing a lot in that respect, in respect of diversity, equity, etc. There has been lots of talk about women in science. So I wanted to talk about women entrepreneurs. For example, you are also a co-founder of Aegis
Aegis
Consulting.
Arts Consulting, that's
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
Hmm.
Arts Consulting. So uh, can you briefly talk about women entrepreneurs and while
Hmm.
while working on the field, how one's gender and ethnicity, etc., play a role in day-to-day life, and how can we overcome any shortcomings or boundaries that come in that respect? And what does equity mean to you?
Um, wow. Let's start with the first, equity.
Sure. Yeah.
What does equity mean to me? And equity means that anyone, any culture, uh, who's working in an office is treated with the same respect, the same interest, and the same desire. Uh, Me as I've always mentored,
Oh yeah.
younger, and I always mentored, normally women of color, because I feel that there's an
Oh, you.
enormous
I think.
disadvantage.
Yeah. I think you also put that you're an advocate for women of color.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Sure.
I do a lot of volunteer work
Oh
around,
yes. Yeah.
um, you know, uh, both social issues and human rights issues. And those are generally focused around women, too. But
Sure.
equity, in my mind, is something that we're striving towards and that we have absolutely not met yet. And one of the reasons for this is because I think that, with the reckoning that came after George Floyd, we can't ever go back to what were more performative institutions
Sure.
than were authentic. And I honestly believe that there are very few authentic, institutions that really interweave, because that's what you have to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Interweave it in every aspect of what your institution is doing. It has to be part of the structure of a center line in your strategic planning. Otherwise, people will have training. Let's say I had wonderful training by a group called Race Forward about um, organizational racism and bias, etc. And but if you have a one-off training, what it has shown, the metrics have shown, and how here we are with numbers, this doesn't help at all. You go to the training, you learn what bias is, but it's not really removed from your head if it's still being practiced in the office.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it is, in my mind, if you're going to be a 21st century leader of a cultural institution or a mathematic institution, you have to be thinking about, am I taking the widest lens possible here? And um, am I not having favorites? Am I being both the managerial and the, I don't want to say more ethical leader that one needs to be in order for collaborative and communicative work to be done? And um, I personally feel that if an institution is going to do this, then it really dedicate itself, then they need to at least have someone who is of color in some sort of very senior leadership position to lead that kind of discussion.
I see.
Because no matter how much of an ally you are to the cause, you do not know what it's like if you've had rocks thrown at you, or if
Oh, yeah.
if you've been considered, to sit at the back of the room and not say anything as a model minority, or if you feel like you've been tokenized at work.
Sure.
So you need someone with lived experience, I think, to really help make massive changes that are difficult, but absolutely fundamentally essential if America is, and other countries are going to be globally connected and aware.
Yeah.
So that's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot to process, but hopefully our audiences will get a direction in which to proceed, right?
Yes,
That's what
yes.
conversations are for. And
Hmm.
can you briefly talk about the arts consulting business, like what goes on in
Oh,
there? And
I'm sorry. That's where we had started. Yes, right.
sure, yeah,
So you know, for various reasons, I had decided to leave the Brooklyn Museum. Um, because I felt as if I could do more for institutions in the DIA, realm and in other realms.
yeah,
But I also wanted to be able to coach and mentor more individuals of color, because that's one of the ways in which resources, and that's what a lot of, I think, anyone who's either, first generation or a minority or a woman, anyone who's generally not cisgender white and privileged, um, you know, uh, you lack resources and support.
sure.
And so I'm lucky enough to have gone through and had a pretty accomplished career in which I've, been part of not only the intellectual culture, but also, the political culture and the internal work culture at places. And the museums are incredibly hierarchical.
Oh, yeah,
And so I found that ways to uh, create a broader pipeline has been able to take these beautiful young minds. And at the Brooklyn Museum, I worked with a lot of um, people of color who were first time museum employees. So on a curatorial level or a public programming level. And
sure.
so it's a complicated and very political, discipline. And so I felt it was an obligation of mine to just walk people through the various nuances.
Yeah, because
And
those
I've been,
hierarchies are often very protected. So
mhm,
yeah, I understand
yes,
what
and
you
if
mean.
yes, so if and I have a conflict between, should one assimilate to, or should someone be in a more kind of change mentality. And I've been in both situations, and I feel, to be true to myself, it's a change mentality. Um, but, there are really, particularly in New York, there are so many pitfalls, and it is a very cutthroat kind of, business. Very competitive in New York. And so I've always felt that it's important to avail myself to younger individuals.
I see.
Um, and then to share what I've learned, because I have been in New York for so long with smaller institutions that don't necessarily have people in areas of expertise that I've had experience in. So that that's been wonderful. And I am trying, I'm looking at starting a coaching, I don't want to say business, but part of my business will be, but it will be for, again, younger generation individuals who need advice on how to gain managerial skills, as well as how to just, I don't want to say maneuver, but how to understand the complexities of these very complicated institutions.
Yeah,
So,
that would be really nice. And please share it on LinkedIn so that we can also get to know about the details of the program in the
mhm,
future. Yeah.
I'm just putting together a website right
Oh,
now.
that would be great. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. I
So,
look forward to seeing it. Yeah.
yeah.
I'll share it with the community when it's ready.
Oh, that's very nice of you. Thank you.
Yeah.
And the other part of the consulting is to be able to use my nonprofit, experience in not only the arts world, but outside of the arts world too, because nonprofit management doesn't mean just arts. It also means, let's say foundations that are raising money for social justice causes. There's very similar types of um, needs in institutions like that. So it's really broadened my perspective a lot and allowed me to see that there is a life outside of just the museum world,
Oh yeah.
which is something I really I think needed. I'm always trying to expand my understanding of the not-for-profit world, uh, and and I've become, as you said, more interested in human rights and social issues, particularly through my volunteer work. So.
Yeah, and continuing that dialogue, I wanted to ask you, like, how important is it to contribute to societal causes? Because you have been active volunteer in soup kitchens, right, in New York. So
Mhm.
how crucial is that for us to look around our society and help each other? And can you briefly talk about your experiences in that regard?
Mm-hmm. I'm happy to. I've been a volunteer at CHIPS since 2018, I think, and I was very active on the floor as well as cooking in a soup kitchen. And it's serves a really large number of homeless individuals, or it's a broad spectrum of people, but people who just don't have the means to eat food. There are students there sometimes that really just need
Sure.
a meal, and it's a free meal. And um, what has always been striking to me is that I would say about 80% of the individuals that come to the kitchens are uh, males, and older, probably in their 50s and 60s, and homeless, which, really says something about the disenfranchisement of a certain group of people in the United States.
Right.
And it's a way of me being able to give back. It's a way of me being able to say, it means so much to, let's say, Sam, who comes every Sunday that I'm working there, that I remember his name and remember to ask, you know, what's going on in his life, how has he been able to get his, identification. Can I, is there any information I can look up for him on the computer that might be helpful? And then attached to that is Francis House, which is a house for um, pregnant mothers who have nowhere else to live, or mothers with toddlers that do not have anywhere to live. And the circumstances could be anything from parents, disowning them, to losing a job and just needing a place, to live. And I am in the process of developing an arts programming for both the adults and children. I want um, around motherhood and representations of motherhood in art. Uh, Mother figures have been celebrated since the beginning of time,
Oh
and
yeah.
up until the 20th century in some ways. And for the children to see that art can be a place of exploration and escape from, or provide beauty to, for you in times of need.
Yes.
And it's just been incredible giving back that way. And I also do a bit of work with the Min Kwan Center for Community Activism, which is founded by a Korean man, and it's to help get out. It's to make Koreans realize how important voting is, Korean Americans, and just several other sort of initiatives around the Korean community, particularly in Flushing. And then I have a reading circle where we read things like Caste by Isabel Wilkerson and White Fragility, and trying to just learn. We were just reading J. Casper Kang's The Loneliness Americans. We read Kathy Parkong's what is it, Asian American Reckoning. You know, so I guess what I'd say to you is, in this whole journey in life, I've become more sensitive and more compassionate to the people around me. And it's been through travel, it's been through gifts and privileges that have been given to me because of the hard work of my father. I love art as a medium of expression of both hope and then the repression that can occur. And my whole goal now really is to just be able to give back in a capacity that has, real meaning. And I hope to do that, through art and social justice practices.
Yeah.
I don't know how much that's going to help your
it helps a lot.
community in your Indian community in Korea. But I will say that I think it takes incredible courage to move to a country where the language is so different and the culture is so different. Even though we're groups, as in my daughter's former school, I was in the Asian Affinity group, and it was everyone from, India and Bangladesh and Pakistan, and then, Central Asia, Thailand, Korea, Japan. It takes courage to really want to learn something in a new environment. And I think it's wonderful to see the Indian community becoming more international this way. And it's really impressive. So
thank you very much for your words. And you talked a lot, and I think that would
that would be enough.
Not in a bad sense, but you talked very passionately, and I'm thankful for
Thank
that.
you.
And I think our viewers will find that really interesting and helpful. And I hope that will help expand people's horizon on various aspects, particularly the societal aspects, because those are the least talked about. And as you said, like, those are the actual courageous acts in our daily lives.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, thank you very much.
Particularly in our day and age, have the courage and the faith in people.
Yes.
You have to have faith that humanity is good, and that there are humane people, almost all of us, and that if we find one another, things will be fine. So thank you so much for having me. It was really, really enjoyable.
Oh yes, it's very enjoyable to talk with you as well. But we are closing up on the 1 hour mark, I think. So I would like to wrap up the conversation, because otherwise it will become too long. But please, before closing up,
sure.
I wanted to ask you, most Indian diaspora in Korea or even worldwide are often involved in science and tech and engineering related disciplines. And it has always, I wanted to talk about this because I hope to expand the contribution of Indian diaspora and maybe Asian diaspora in arts related disciplines as well.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you think can be done to help increase the participation in arts and other humanities related disciplines? And I was thinking possible answer could be education, or do parents play a big role in shaping the worldview of the child from an early age? Or what are your thoughts on it? I just want to,
I think so. I mean, I'm at the point where I can be self-reflective, right?
Sure.
I'm older. I've been through, I've had several, very interesting, career paths and positions. I think you have to. There's something that I have a coach. She works with women of color. She's wonderful, and one of the things that she got me thinking, if you look at me just on paper, I went to very good universities. I went to Oxford. I got a distinction. I went to, the most prominent, school for art history, and received a PhD. I worked at the Metropolitan Museum, and that's wonderful. But much of that was based on my parents' dream for me.
Okay.
And then there is also the American dream. And then there's also my dream.
Yes.
And what I would really suggest is that if you are interested in art history, just visual culture in general,
Yes.
I do not know what's available in India in terms of training, if there
Oh,
are majors in that area, but there are all sorts of scholarships that individuals can take advantage of. And um, you don't have to study Indian art. You can study Renaissance art if you would like, or Korean art, or contemporary global art. It's this whole idea that, a discipline is owned by someone, I think, is, or a group is, kind of
yeah.
silly. Uh, but, I my advice to you, if you are interested in, is just always make sure that you're working towards something that is going to satisfy you, that's going to bring joy to you. And sometimes, as we know, because we come from very traditional cultures,
Yes.
our parents want us to be something. They want us to have that degree. It's so important to them. They sacrifice so much for us. But we also have to be doing something that gives something to our soul. So if you can find a way to do both, that would be my
That would be the sweet
advice.
spot. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if you're interested in art history, we'll do it as a minor then. And then volunteer and see where
Yeah.
that leads. But there are also so many projects now that involve art and science,
Oh,
uh,
yeah.
that
That's
we
right.
could talk about it some other time. Um,
Recently I drew a cover picture for a journal, so that was fun. So I did a 3D art for the journal
well,
cover.
which is,
Yeah.
yeah, which is really wonderful. But how can science contribute to art and vice versa is
Sure. Yeah.
a very important topic right now, and technology.
Oh, yes.
Um, you
Lots
know,
of technologies is being nowadays used to analyze paintings and help in the
mhm.
museum. Yeah.
But there's also obviously, I think there was just recently a Rembrandt, I think, that where it was looked under a certain type of light, and or maybe it was a Van Gogh, and there was a portrait of him underneath this painting. So there's that type of
Oh,
work
yes.
because of
Yeah.
development of technology, and
Recently,
then
in another painting, they found their reflection in a small, like a painting inside a painting, and that was
right,
recently discovered using
yes,
some technique.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah. I can't remember if I had prepared on that part. I but next time, Vikram.
Sure.
But you know, there's also the controversy of technology coming in and changing the way we're viewing art. So you
I
can go
see.
have a more experiential type of, let's say with Van Gogh, what they're doing is you sit in a room and they play these slides over you. So as if you're experiencing sitting in the painting. I'm still at a, I'm not sure what I think about it yet, because I
Sure.
would really like people to look at the real painting. But then again, why are we looking at these paintings in museums? And they're deciding the way we look at it. So maybe just taking another viewpoint is a good way to sort of break out of that
Uh-huh.
type of thinking. So yeah. So there's just a lot of different ways actually, and that may be something that we can use. I could suggest someone to come on and talk about art and technology in a way I think that would be relevant to
Yeah.
um, a lot of the students in Korea right now. You're the Indian diaspora, so
I learned a lot talking with you, and
I learned a lot too.
yeah, thank you very much
So
for that. Yes.
yes,
Because it's not
uh,
often that I get to talk with people from, especially your kind of background, people from
hmm
arts or museums and those kind of disciplines. I usually get to talk with people from mainly science, but I
hmm
try my best to reach out to people from various other disciplines as well. Like I've had
hmm
social scientists and others on the podcast as well. So
hmm
I had a professor of literature in the last episode. So I try
hmm
to
Oh,
reach
this
out
is
to people.
David, right? Tazar, right? Is that right? Or is that David?
Yeah, David,
He
he
was
was
recent.
on
Yeah.
he was on one of the episodes. I recently
Hmm.
had a Professor Scott Shefford, who is a
Okay.
professor of literature. He works on Shakespeare and plays and stuff like that. So it was very
Hmm.
interesting to talk with him as well.
Hmm.
So it's something that I try to gain, like talk about the experiences of people from other backgrounds, because
Hmm.
I want to bridge the gap, because
Hmm.
it's all science and tech here mainly.
Hmm.
So,
Well, you have so many great national museums that you can go to
oh
too.
yeah, 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 yeah.
And yeah,
Sure.
so take, yeah, those are things to take advantage of. But,
Seoul
and
National
then maybe the
Museum is
next person,
excellent. Yeah.
oh, it's a wonderful collection. And next time you have maybe an art historian on, they can maybe bring pictures, which would be nice too, right?
Oh yeah,
So,
yeah. That would be great.
so
Yeah.
yeah.
Maybe we can have you down the line as well, because I don't think we have so many things to talk about, and the single episode will become too long. So maybe I can have you on some later episode, and we can talk about more
Oh,
about
I'd
art.
love to do that. So, you know, you will probably edit this down, I would imagine,
Not really. I want it I want it
right?
all to be there. Uh,
Okay.
yeah. So
I would
those
be
were,
happy to come back at some point and just
yeah,
kind of
sure.
show
Yeah.
you, give you examples of what I'm talking
Yeah,
about.
that would be great, because one time I had a guy from Australia.
Mhm,
So he's a freelance illustrator. So he
mhm.
showed us some of his work as well. So yeah, uh, maybe later we can also
Sure.
get
That would
your
be great.
information. Yeah, so that would be great.
Yeah,
And
that would be great.
yeah, so
Okay.
Jennifer,
Well,
so the
when you're
time
in
is
New
up.
York the next time, please come and say
Sure.
hello. And
Yeah.
as I said, thank you so much. This is a very enjoyable conversation for me. So,
Oh, yes. And before we close, do you have any questions for me, or do you have any thing to say before we close?
um, what I would say is that uh, if you are an expat or a foreigner, you know, a student, a foreign student studying at, you know, a foreign university, to just really try to expand your world
Hmm.
outside of, let's say, what, you know, is your comfort zone, which would
Yeah.
probably generally be people from your culture.
Oh, yes,
Now,
yes.
there's another part of me. I don't have people from my culture because I am not, you know, I'm not white and I'm not, you know, I'm mixed blood Korean. So it was easier for me, but I have friends now from all over the world
Oh,
who
yeah.
I still stay in contact with because I was at an international university. You know, one of my best friends is now the advisor to the president of Chile on environmental, you know, the impact and climate change. And then, you know, I have friends, you know, in Greece, I have friends in Africa, I have
Oh, yeah.
friends, you know, all over who are real friends, who are people who I changed and learned with. And so if you can really find the time to um, meet other people from other cultures and spend time with them, I think it's one of the most important things studying abroad.
Yes.
So, uh, yes. And then I would like to say hello to my Aunt Young Hee and my Aunt Young Ja in Korea.
Okay. Hello.
Okay. Thank
Yes.
you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jennifer. And it was really nice to talk with you. And hopefully we stay in touch and have a conversation later on down the line. Yeah,
Great. Thank you
that would
so
be great.
much.
Yes. Okay.
Okay. Bye
Thank you very
bye.
much, Jennifer. Bye bye. Yes. Take care.